This is probably one of the most important topics to be talking about. I talked about information fighting games in the past. I also talked about processing tier lists, which is also very important. So this is a really tough topic, right? This is really rough because it's like, it implies that you need some form of baseline, right? Like you need some form of baseline to understand what is worthwhile. And there's a lot of character specific things you can apply to be more consistent. We're going to talk more from a system-based perspective. What makes Soul consistent in Xrd is a lot different than in Strive, right? It's very, 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 very different. A lot of the same ideas in consistency through system mechanics is still applicable. You can almost apply most of this to almost every game. But the idea is you have to understand a certain amount of things to really kind of give you an idea of okay, well, this is worth doing here, this is worth doing there. Number one, the most valuable thing about consistency in fighting games is just in itself. It's obvious, right? When you say oh, who wouldn't want to be consistent in fighting games? Who would say that, right? Who would, right? A lot of people understand how important it is to be consistent, but they don't actually apply methods to be consistent, right? Just inherently. I think another great example is poker, right? In poker games, it's it can be inherently random, but there is still consistency through your methods. Ideally, you want consistency through whatever method you take. Again, I'm not a poker pro, but I've talked to someone who was a poker pro before, so I do understand a mild correlation. I'm glad you actually asked this. How do I be consistent but not predictable? This is kind of a incorrect view of consistency. This implies if you are consistent but you are essentially dying to being predictable, then you're not necessarily consistent. It's very important to recognize that there's layers. There's layers layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Just as a base. Layer 1, maybe you do the consistently good things with your character. This is how a lot of people tend to do. The problem with this is that your character's established goal is predictable. Now, a lot of people tend to think oh, this means I go random. If you end up being random, you will ultimately start doing things that do not benefit you or work in your character's favor. I have to represent this here. Here, let me make this bigger. This axle is my extremely effective zoning style is too good. I'm IAD in and see what happens. A lot of people do this. Or some people just get, impatient and they end up, going away from their baseline, right? So for the next layers, we're gonna pause this for a second and I'm going to just talk about why consistency is important and what it means. So again, consistency is obviously important because if you are consistently successful, you are just that, right? You are just consistently successful. Ideally, that's what you want. No matter what, in fighting games, there's gonna be things like RPSs, you're gonna have to guess. But if you can always fall back on a form of consistency, that's what makes players great. I've once mentioned that the real goal of fighting games is to essentially force your opponent to just do shit and be able to punish without taking any risk. But here's a basic example. If you IAD on someone, it usually will just result in one or two things. You get in, they anti-air you. This interaction is entirely dependent on your opponent is good enough to anti-air you. This means if they can react to your anti-air every single time, or your IAD, sorry, then that means that they will essentially punish you every time. Let's say staying on the ground. You can represent, a micro dash to see if they twitch, a full on dash to start your offense if they're not ready, maybe backstep to make more space, neutral jump. You can see that even if I stop here, there's way more things to both keep in mind of, but it's also not as easy to deal with. In the context of Guilty Gear, it's usually the character on the ground usually has the advantage over the character directly above them. But all these things are all just safety based, right? Worst case scenario, most of the time you're gonna just end up blocking, which blocking isn't ideal, but it's a lot different than getting comboed or not, right? Blocking is better than getting hit. A lot of people tend to forget this because, if you block, it could be really bad. I know, this is groundbreaking stuff. When I say things like this, you're like, oh, of course, the funny cow lady. Oh, so funny. When you're playing, A lot of people will actually choose to get hit over block. If you want proof, look at Leo. Look at Leo players. You think I'm lying, but I'm not. Like, if you say it like, oh yeah, consistency is important in fighting games, people will be like, of course, like, why would you not want to be consistent? But then they play it and they're doing like, they just hard gamble every single time. Every single time. Every single time. Usually when I do these discussions, I talk about if you want to improve and be like a high level tournament player, right? Like, that's the goal. If you have fun just like, I don't know, like twerking all over the screen as Leo, then you know what? Go off. Go off king, go off queen, go off emperor. Twerk to your heart's content, okay? So that's kind of the problem with also like characters like Potemkin. Potemkin is a great example of a very consistent character at low level, but very inconsistent at high level. Less so in Strive. Grapplers tend to actually, and not only just grapplers, but a lot of strike throw characters like Soul or Mei also tend to kind of put people in this sort of bubble. Their options are extremely effective at low level, but not as effective as they go higher up, and as a result, it becomes very unfun to play. Not all decisions are equal. I gotta do different stuff or I'm predictable. This is not inherently wrong, but how people do this is usually wrong. Varying your movement, approaching with different buttons, challenging in different ways. These are good because most of the time they have a direct like benefit. Now, bad unpredictability, usually high gamble options that could be defeated not through understanding the matchup, but through understanding RPS. Again, I love this example. A lot of options that are really aggressive do minimize the scope of what can happen. This is why understanding RPS, rock, paper, scissors, right, is so important. Here is why the difference between the opportunity to do damage and immediately doing damage is significant, right? Even with characters like Zato or Happy Chaos or whoever else they add with no reversal, you can always have options through defensive mechanics in the game, right? Even though a lot of people don't like YRC, having the threat of YRC is very powerful, and that's kind of what we're going to get into. This is why meter is so important in fighting games. Usually, if you can represent an option just by having meter, right? Like if they have to like, okay, well, I'm expecting a YRC here. If they don't, even if they kind of don't respect it and it creates an RPS situation, it's still an RPS situation in your favor. It's not always the most ideal, but of course, it's something they have to consider. That's the key thing. A lot of the time, it's not really even in the option, it's in the threat of the option. I know I love talking about it, but it's one of the core things of consistency, because just by having meter, you make things more consistent if they are willing to pay attention to your options. If they're not willing, you get out for free every time. See, it's very simple. If they're not willing to really look for things like this, then you get out. Here's a great example that a lot of people tend to see and really understand at this point. If you have 100 meter, you have to be mindful of super RC, right? Super common, super common. Sometimes just because you understand that this option is like present, it means that sometimes you can just choose a not as safe defensive option to get out. You may just backdash out. If you do this, it creates an RPS situation here where now they recognize you will leverage the threat of meter, which creates a whole different situation. There's a lot of situations, again, that can kind of boil down to this sort of interaction, right? But what we're really looking for as a consistent player are these sort of options, right? The ones where there's a lot of representation, there's a lot to threaten, right? The key is threatening options. You don't want to choose things that just minimize it. A lot of people, when you say it like this, think, oh, of course, funny meme, Cal lady, LOL, you know, whatever. But again, they play in a way that does not indicate they value this, right? As you get more consistent, it usually means that you can leverage the system mechanics in a safe way, right? So like having things like FD is very beneficial, or YRC, right? These are all options that are valuable because they are to everyone, right? They're to everyone. So layer 2 is usually leveraging like these sort of things. So again, no matter what, your character's game plan can be predictable, right? Because every character has a game plan. Everyone knows that Leo wants to flash kick you and starts offense. That's kind of the core idea. It varies per character because a lot of people will kind of make mind games out of their character's kit in this way, right? Because if you expect, let's say Leo to flash kick you every time, they may do some crazy shit like dash up throw. If you aren't familiar with these things or understanding how to beat it, you fucking panic. When you get past this point of like overcommitting to compensate for your established threat, it kind of boils down to this, which is, I should say there's only really 3 or 4 main layers. You minimize the amount of risks you take and try to do your character's game plan as safely as possible. And this is a general thing that honestly, some of the stronger characters can tend to bypass. The reason why this layer is above this one I noted where, right, essentially this is the do crazy shit and be unpredictable by any means. This is sort of the counter to layer 2 in that even if you are wrong, you have more health, more meter, etc. to compensate for those interactions, right? And now I'm gonna hit you with this. Layer 4, balancing all of that together, right? I know that's a surprise. If you're too predictable, and even in like, let's say layer 3 is very strong, but of course there is a weakness to being too predictable. Now with balancing, especially layer 2, it means you don't want to force things unnecessarily. That's the key detail still. Like a lot of players will take really big gambles or gamble more often than not. Some will not gamble as much as other people. Vortex randomly is still not on the table, I'm sorry. You want to maximize all these options and minimize all of these, right? That's the goal. Let them vortex. No, if you vortex in my chat, you're banned forever. Even if you are playing perfectly, like let's say you're playing layer 3, you don't take those gambles. The problem is you will inevitably be in situations where this sort of minimization of options is forced on you. If you have like 3% HP against Nago as Soul and you're full screen and Nago has level 3 blood, you know, like that's a minimized situation. If you just sit there and block, you're probably gonna die, right? Like, because he's just gonna chip you out. Again, let's say assuming you have no meter too. Now, this is kind of the problem though. You vortex here. Problem is, because this is such an unfavorable situation, it becomes layer 2. Even if you play perfectly, you could be put into a situation like this where you have to gamble, which means the correct layer here is honestly just trying to survive by any means necessary. And this is where a lot of players tend to differ, which means that directly layer 2 here is correct. Layer 3 is actually correct because of layer 1. I know that makes no fucking sense, but this is kind of the problem with this. If you have an option that is directly strong, then it becomes predictable. If it's very predictable, then that means essentially they will be more ready to cover, especially in situations where there's a low risk, which means your best option is to usually play as safe as possible and try to win even in situations that don't really favor you so much. Like if you play safe here, really like it's usually better than committing harder. It's not like flipping a coin because like it's not directly, see, flipping a coin is more like this, right? This is what we were talking about. You can see here, I guess it's more like rolling a dice. I guess that's kind of it. I don't know, that doesn't sound much better, does it? But you can see there's a lot of difference in how these sort of interactions happen. And this is why I talk about layers most of all in neutral, because neutral is usually going to be your most consistent approach. How can you be more consistent, right? Are you committing to options that are high risk but low to medium reward? If you are, stop. Stop frequently. If frequent, please stop. This is usually like a big factor of what makes top level players top level, right? Because like even if you gamble heavily, if you can predict what they're doing every time, it doesn't matter, right? Like there's a lot of different players. That's why there's the, you know, that whole chart, like a body, mind, and heart sort of thing, right? Consider how to adjust your predictability with less aggressive options. You are not big strong, okay? Maybe you are big strong, but you don't have to be. If you use a lot of meter for situations, consider how much easier, or how much harder I should say, it is to get in without meter, right? It could be successful, but you have to consider, here's how I think about it. You spend 50 meter to just get in on them, and it just resets to neutral. You basically ordered food and threw it in the trash. And I will never forgive you for doing that. So there's two advantages that we'll talk about. So if you spend meter to force something, it usually will result in them blocking wherever they stand. It sounds obvious, right? If you walk towards someone and they're afraid of you, you will probably walk them to the corner, which makes your offense better. Additionally, the less space that you create for them to move in, the more predictable they will be. This is essentially the weakness of layer 3. Even if you are trying to whiff punish, if you constantly give up space, you will eventually get to a point where you have to do something, right? Just like that. You have to just do something. Meter is key. You do not waste meter on forcing offense frequently. Like, it should not be a core milestone of your game plan. This will be on the midterm. Right, perfect. That's basically it. So we've talked about a lot. In fact, it was about an hour that we talked about this. So it went a little longer than usual, but I'm glad that this is helpful, and I hope that it enlightens some people.